Operation Epic Fury was an epic success. It achieved the desired ends, the very specifically and limited objectives of that operation as were articulated at the time. Right now, the president has been trying to broker a peace and get the Strait of Hormuz reopened. All of the nations of the world have an interest in that, most more than us. And we have called upon our NATO allies and the Arab states in the region and the neighboring states there to assist in this very important endeavor to get the Strait of Hormuz reopened. The president is negotiating a peace, and the Iranians continue to provoke us. As you know, they sent a drone into one of our two of our pilots. We're flying one of our helicopters, one of our jets, they're firing on us all the time. The helicopter, as you know, the president described it, this drone lodged into the middle.
Good to see you again. John here. Let's begin. Mike Johnson holds the title of Speaker, but Donald Trump is running the House legislation lives or dies based on Trump's demands, not Johnson's gavel. The gap between title and power has never been more visible, as Johnson struggles to control a chamber that answers to the president. This has been documented in real time in reporting from the New York Times and other major outlets. It has been visible in floor fights that played out on live camera. It has been demonstrated in bipartisan bills that were pulled not because Johnson decided to pull them, but because Trump posted something on social media and House Republicans started receiving phone calls from their political supporters and texts from their donor networks and messages from people who are very skilled at communicating what happens to Republican incumbents who do not follow the president's lead.
Where they were flying it, and they had to take the thing down into the water to put the fire out. Miraculously, they survived. We have the greatest military equipment of any fighting force on the planet. But that was a very provocative thing for Iran to do. And the president felt, he's the commander-in-chief, and his top advisors at the Pentagon, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, they felt that it required a proportional response. Right now, they are working to have that situation resolved, and they're doing the best they can. And we have negotiators over there, our envoys, who are working around the clock to bring this to a conclusion. But the Iranians have shown, at least for the time being, that they're unwilling to do that. And so we are hopeful that that works out. We have to allow the space to do it. We're about 100 days into this conflict, and the Congress has to allow the commander-in-chief to do what it is he's doing. So we'll see how that goes. Yes.
That is the actual chain of command in the House right now. Not the constitutional one, not the one that involves committee assignments and floor schedules and leadership meetings. The real chain of command runs from Trump's social media account through the fear response of Republican members and straight to whatever Johnson ends up announcing at the next leadership press conference. Johnson schedules a vote. Trump reacts against it. House Republicans react to Trump's reaction. Johnson pulls a vote he just scheduled. The chamber erupts into the kind of factional confusion and public finger-pointing that has become essentially the default state of this House under this majority.
Well, good morning, everybody. This is a great day, great week to be an American, to celebrate the greatest nation in the history of the world, and it's not even close. And you all hear me remind us of that all the time. The most free, most successful, most powerful, most benevolent nation that has ever been on planet Earth. America is back right now, and there are so many reasons to be excited and to celebrate with your family and friends. Celebrate freedom, celebrate the great blessings we have to be in this country, the greatest on the planet. We've got challenges, of course. We're working through those every day, but there is no reason not to celebrate. There is no reason to be depressed in any way. We recognize 250 years is still an experiment. We're still a grand experiment in self-governance. In 1776, the founders came together and they boldly proclaimed a self-evident truth. We call it the nation's creed. It's like a statement of faith. And they said right in the second paragraph of the Declaration, which we celebrate this weekend, we hold these truths to be self-evident. And what is a self-evident truth? It's something that's obvious. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. And I always pause there and say, note that it doesn't say born equal. It says created equal by God.
And then the cycle begins again with the next piece of legislation. This is not speculation. This is not exaggeration. This is the documented reality of how the House of Representatives functions in this moment. Let me give you the specific moments, because this is a story that has documented receipts at every stage. In the spring of this year, House Republican leaders abruptly pulled a bipartisan war powers resolution that had been scheduled for a floor vote. This was not a surprise maneuver. It was a vote that had been on the calendar. It was a vote that Johnson had been publicly considering allowing to proceed. It was a vote that bipartisan members had been building support for across both parties. And then Trump and his allies pushed back intensely against any measure that would, in their framing, tie the president's hands on the Iran war.
And that it is God, our Creator, who gives us our inalienable rights, that among those the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That statement was so revolutionary when it was made, when Jefferson wrote it on behalf of a small committee of founders, including Franklin and Adams, and they came up with that precise language. They were very careful in how they articulated that. They wanted to make this bold proclamation of something that was obviously true. And we are the stewards of that great foundational principle and truth. It means that everybody's made equally, created equally. It means that we all have, we strive for equality of opportunity. It means that every single person has inestimable dignity and value because our Creator made us in His image. The men that wrote that understood it from Scripture. That is what made America exceptional. That's what set us on the path to be the great nation that we are, one nation under God. Now, all of you know, because you've been in the chamber a lot, because you cover us, if we were there, we walked over there right now, one of the first things you notice if we come in the door where members come in is that inscription of the national motto right above the speaker's rostrum. And if you look in the visitor's guide, it says the People's Guide, Visitor's Guide to the People's House.
And the vote disappeared. It was yanked from the calendar before it could happen because one person who holds no seat in that chamber and faces none of its voters made clear he did not want it to happen. And the Speaker of the House, the constitutional officer who is supposed to run the chamber according to his members' will, went along with that preference. That is the dynamic captured in today's story. Not a formal stripping of authority through a parliamentary procedure, just a quiet, practical reality that what was once Johnson's decision to make is now Trump's decision to approve or veto. And the Speaker is the one who carries out the verdict.
It's a beautiful publication they published some years back. We still hand it out, full color. On page 21, it talks about why the motto is above the Speaker's head and when it was placed there. And it says there it was placed in 1962 by Congress as a rebuke to the Soviets' philosophy during the Cold War. What was the Soviets' philosophy? Marxism and its deviations, communism. Marxism, socialism, communism begin with the premise that there is no God. And Congress saw fit in the early 60s to make sure that we put that right there above the head of the Speaker because every member of Congress has to face that podium every single day, and they wanted future generations of Americans, and certainly those elected to represent the people, to remember what distinguishes America, that we are defined by our national creed, the foundational principle that set us on course to be so great. Now, here's what we face right now, surreal as it is. On the anniversary of the country, we have an open contest right now between the Marxists and communists.
And then there is the debt ceiling disaster and the government funding fights and the cascade of procedural chaos that follows every major legislative moment in this environment, each one following the same basic pattern. Johnson tries to assemble a deal. Trump blows it up or demands it be rebuilt to his specifications. Republicans fracture trying to respond to both the Speaker's leadership and the president's demands simultaneously. Nothing passes the way it was supposed to. And the chamber runs on a combination of short-term patches, last-minute reversals, and the constant threat of a shutdown or a default that never quite materializes, but is always hanging in the background, like a permanent weather system that everyone has just learned to live with. Now, let's go through the specific moments, because understanding each one is important, and the pattern that emerges from them together is the thing that really matters. Let's start with the War Powers Resolution, because this one is the most constitutionally significant and the most recent. The War Powers Resolution is a law that has been on the books since the early 1972. It was passed specifically to reassert Congress's constitutional role in decisions about going to war and continuing military hostilities. The framers of the Constitution gave Congress, not the president, the power to declare war. They did that deliberately. They understood what unchecked executive military power looked like from their experience with the British Crown. And they built a system where one person could not unilaterally commit the nation to military conflict without legislative authorization. The War Powers Resolution is the modern expression of that principle. And when the United States got involved in a military conflict with Iran, a conflict that is now dragged on for over 100 days, that has killed American service members, that has produced Iranian missile strikes on Gulf states, that is contributing to gas prices at record levels, and inflation that is hurting working families, bipartisan members of Congress started gathering support for a resolution to reassert that constitutional role. They wanted to say Congress has a say in whether this continues. The president does not have unlimited authority to pursue military hostilities without our authorization. This is what the Constitution says, and we are going to vote on it. And then Trump pushed back, and Johnson pulled the vote. Now here is why that sequence matters so much. It is more than just a procedural story about a vote that got yanked. The Speaker of the House has enormous power over what comes to the floor. The Speaker controls the schedule. The Speaker decides what gets voted on and when. And when the Speaker of the House exercises that power to prevent Congress from doing something that a bipartisan majority of members actually want to do, in deference to what the president of the opposite branch of government wants, that is a significant constitutional moment. It is a speaker using his procedural power not to advance the will of the chamber he leads, but to protect the power of the executive branch against the chamber he leads. And it is happening in the context of a war and active military conflict in which American troops are dying, where the constitutional question of who authorizes and controls that conflict is not an academic exercise. It is a live and urgent constitutional question with life and death stakes. And Johnson's answer to that question after Trump weighed in was to take the vote off the table, to let the president's position stand without a formal congressional challenge. And that is what this looks like in the specific context of war powers. Not a dramatic public confrontation, just a vote that disappears from the calendar. Now let's go back a little further because the debt ceiling fight from late last year is actually where the pattern of Trump undercutting Johnson was first established in full view. And it set the template for everything that has followed. In the final months of last year, the House was trying to pass a bipartisan government funding bill that would have kept the government running through the transition period. And Trump and his allies, using social media, using direct calls, using a network of donors and influencers and online communities that respond to their signals, launched a campaign against the bill. They demanded that House Republicans kill it. They went further than that. They called for scrapping the debt ceiling entirely so that the incoming Trump administration could borrow without limit, which would effectively remove a key legislative check on executive spending from Congress's hands and hand it to the White House. Johnson, facing the threat of Trump-backed primary challenges against any Republican who voted for the bipartisan bill, pulled the legislation. He tried to rewrite it to satisfy Trump's demands. And then, in one of the most humiliating floor moments of the recent congressional session, the rewritten bill was rejected by an alliance of Democrats and the far-right House Freedom Caucus members who were never satisfied with anything that is not a total victory. Johnson was left with nothing. The bipartisan bill was gone. The Trump-demanded replacement was gone. And Johnson emerged from the episode bruised and weakened, with his authority visibly diminished and his ability to deliver the House for Trump, even when he was trying to do exactly what Trump wanted, exposed as significantly less than what the Speaker's title suggests. And that is the core irony of this situation that deserves more attention than it gets. Johnson has not been undermined by Trump only when he was resisting Trump. He has been undermined by Trump even when he was trying to comply. Because the problem is not specifically Johnson's willingness to follow Trump's lead. The problem is structural. The problem is a majority so thin, so razor thin, that literally any small group of Republicans can kill any piece of legislation by voting against it. And because Trump has trained the hard right of the caucus to always push for more, to always demand a pure version of any victory, to always treat compromise as capitulation, Johnson cannot assemble a majority for anything, including the things Trump explicitly wants. That is the debt ceiling lesson. That is the funding bill lesson. That is the structural chaos that has defined this House under this Speaker with this majority. Now let's talk about what the political commentary has been describing in more colorful terms. Because the framing of Johnson as Speaker in name only is capturing something real that deserves to be taken seriously as analysis rather than dismissed as political entertainment. When Trump can use social media and private calls to direct House members around the Speaker. When he can tell individual Republicans which bills to tank, which procedural moves to make, which votes to show up for, and which ones to skip without consequence. He is effectively creating a parallel chain of command that bypasses the constitutional officer who is supposed to be leading the chamber. And that parallel chain of command is more powerful than the official one. Not because Trump has formal authority over House members. He does not. The Constitution gives him no role in the internal governance of a separate branch of government. But he has something that the Constitution cannot grant and that Johnson cannot replicate. The ability to make a Republican member's political life very difficult very quickly through the mechanism of primary threats, base mobilization, donor pressure, and the kind of social media attacks that can make an incumbent suddenly vulnerable in a district they have been winning for years. That is the coercive power that replaces the procedural power. That is what makes the parallel chain of command work. And Johnson, who has none of those levers, is left to preside over a chamber where his own institutional tools for leadership, committee assignments, floor scheduling, leadership message coordination have been rendered secondary to a form of coercive pressure he cannot compete with and cannot match. And here is the thing that the upcoming election framing adds to all of this. Because the political stakes are not just institutional, they are electoral. News outlets have been describing what they call an unavoidable clash between Trump's self-serving and chaotic governance and Republicans' political survival in competitive districts. Because the members who are most afraid of Trump's primary threats tend to be the ones in safe Republican districts. The members who need to win swing districts, the ones who make up a significant portion of the thin majority, are the ones who actually need to be able to point to governance, to constituent services, to legislative achievements, to evidence that they are doing something useful in Washington rather than just cycling through funding crises and yanked votes and floor eruptions. And those members are watching what is happening to the chamber under this leadership dynamic and feeling a very specific kind of dread. Because the chaos that protects Trump's political position, the unpredictability, the constant crisis mode, the inability of anyone to pin down what the House actually stands for or plans to do, is the exact opposite of what a competitive district Republican needs to run a successful re-election campaign. They need normalcy, they need achievements, they need to be able to say, here is what we got done. And the House that Trump and his approach to congressional leadership have produced is not giving them any of that. It is giving them chaos. And chaos in a majority this thin is how you lose a majority. Now let's also look at what the insiders have been saying, because some of the most honest assessments of Johnson's situation have come from within the Republican orbit itself. A long analysis of Trump's government funding fights from late last year described Johnson in terms that have only become more accurate over time. Never a natural fit for the speakership, stuck between Trump and the hard right of the House with a vanishingly slim majority that leaves him constantly vulnerable to rebellion. The piece warned that by failing to deliver on Trump's key demands, or even when trying to deliver and still failing because the math does not work, Johnson had alienated the incoming president and made it likelier that his own members would eventually refuse to keep him in the speaker's chair. That analysis was written before the War Powers vote was pulled, before the latest round of floor chaos, and it has held up extremely well. Johnson is in a position where he cannot satisfy Trump completely because no Speaker of a House this divided can reliably deliver floor majorities for any specific agenda. And he cannot build the kind of independent institutional coalition with Democrats that would give him the tools to actually govern, because doing so would invite exactly the primary threat that ends speakerships in the current Republican environment. He is stuck, and the chamber he is stuck presiding over is erupting accordingly. Let's pull this together because the specific incidents are revealing enough on their own, but the picture they form together is what matters most for understanding what happens in Congress over the rest of this administration. The war powers vote being yanked is a constitutional story, not just a political story. And it deserves to be treated with the seriousness that a constitutional story requires, rather than being folded into the general noise of congressional procedural drama. When the Speaker of the House prevents Congress from voting on whether it authorizes an ongoing military conflict at the explicit direction of the president who is conducting that conflict, there is a word for what has happened to the balance of power between the branches of government. That word is erosion, not collapse, not a crisis in the dramatic sense that word sometimes implies, but a slow, procedural, almost invisible erosion of the constitutional design. The framers gave Congress the power over declarations of war, specifically because they did not trust any single person with that power unchecked. They built the system to require legislative consent for sustained military hostilities. And every time a vote like this gets pulled, every time Congress declines to exercise the authority it has in deference to what a president wants, that authority atrophies. Not because it was formally removed, because it was voluntarily not used. And the pattern of Johnson pulling votes at Trump's direction is over time producing a House that is less of a co-equal branch and more of a ratification body for decisions made in the executive branch. That is a significant constitutional shift, and it is happening quietly without drama, one pulled vote at a time. The debt ceiling fight exposed the specific structural problem that makes all of this possible, and that has no easy solution inside the current majority. The House Republican caucus is too fractured to assemble reliable majorities for almost anything, including the things Trump explicitly wants. The far-right members are willing to blow up any deal that does not give them everything they want. The moderate members are afraid to vote for deals that give the far-right everything it wants. And Trump has trained the far-right to always demand more, to always treat compromise as capitulation, to always push for a pure version of every victory, which means Johnson cannot go right without losing the moderates, cannot go center without triggering Trump's ire, and cannot build a durable majority for anything. The debt ceiling episode made that visible in the most embarrassing possible way. Trump demanded a bill. Johnson produced a version of what Trump wanted. And it failed because the members who are most loyal to Trump voted against the bill that Trump's own team had asked Johnson to deliver. That is not a coalition. That is a self-defeating cycle. And the structural conditions that produce it, a thin majority, a radicalized hard right, an external power center in the form of the president, are not going away because of anything Johnson can do or say or legislate. They are baked into the arithmetic of the majority and the political culture of the caucus. And the next government funding deadline, the next debt ceiling trigger, the next piece of legislation that requires actual floor votes is going to produce the same cycle because the conditions that produce chaos are still in place. The speaker in name-only framing understates the institutional problem because it focuses on Johnson when it should focus on the chamber itself. The issue is not specifically Mike Johnson's weaknesses or his political history or his comfort level with the speakership. The issue is that the House of Representatives, the constitutional institution, is not currently functioning as an independent co-equal branch of government on the questions that matter most. It is not exercising its war powers authority independently. It is not managing its own budget and debt ceiling process independently. It is taking its cues from a president who has no formal role in the chamber's governance, but has built enough informal leverage over enough members that he can shape outcomes without ever casting a vote. And that is a structural constitutional problem that goes well beyond the specific personalities involved. A future speaker, even one more politically skilled than Johnson, even one with more institutional credibility or a more comfortable relationship with Trump, would face the same structural constraint. Because the constraint is not the speaker. The constraint is a governing majority so thin and so fractured that the only way to hold it together is through external coercive pressure from someone with more political leverage than any internal leadership team can generate. And Trump is that someone. And this is the point that deserves the most attention as we close. The chaos is not a bug of this approach to House governance. It is a feature, a chaotic House, a House that cannot pass oversight legislation, that cannot exercise war powers authority, that cannot hold meaningful hearings without fracturing over procedural fights, is a House that provides very little meaningful check on the executive branch. In that outcome, an executive branch operating with reduced legislative constraint is the practical result of everything we have described today. Not through any formal change to the Constitution, not through any explicit legislative grant of power, just through the quiet, daily accumulated practice of a speaker who cannot schedule a vote without Trump's approval, a caucus that cannot hold together without Trump's threat system, and a chamber that cannot govern itself without constantly referencing what the president wants. The constitutional design assumed that the branches would compete, that Congress would jealously guard its own institutional prerogatives, that the people who ran the House would resist encroachment on their authority. What we are watching instead is a speaker who is largely comfortable with the encroachment, not because he agrees with it philosophically, but because resisting it would end his speakership. And that is the most corrosive version of institutional erosion. Not dramatic, not sudden, just a slow daily accumulation of decisions made by someone who chose survival over independence in a chamber that is erupting into chaos as a result. Stay tuned because this story is far from over, and the implications for American governance are only going to become more apparent as the chaos continues to unfold.